Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the workshop Women Entrepreneurs in Sustainability, equipping Canadian SMEs with skills in the transition to the green economy with Wendy Sukier, Academic Director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub at Toronto Metropolitan University. This workshop is presented by our partners at the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. And today you will explore the intersection of women entrepreneurship and sustainability within the context of small and medium sized enterprises in Canada. I encourage you to engage in the chat throughout the workshop and let us know what you connect most with. Let's keep the conversation going beyond the workshop. Share your takeaways on socials using the hashtag StrikeUp. I am pleased to introduce you to your facilitator, Dr. Wendy Sukier. Wendy is a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at the Ted Rogers School of Business at Toronto Metropolitan University and one of Canada's leading experts on disruptive technologies, future skills, and inclusive innovation. She is the co-author of Innovation Nation, Canadian Leadership from Java to Jurassic Park, and has authored over 200 articles. She leads Toronto's Metropolitan University's Diversity Institute and also leads the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, created to promote an inclusive innovation system to grow and develop women-led businesses. Please welcome Dr. Wendy Sukier.
I am going to talk about some research we recently did with Corrales, which many of you may know, formerly CEO. I'll start by talking a bit about the Diversity Institute and some of the overall goals driving us to net zero economy. I'll talk about women in sustainability and how we see inclusive innovation. So about the Diversity Institute, as was mentioned, we're located in the Ted Rogers School of Management. So our focus is very much on how to advance productivity, innovation, as well as social justice. We're very focused on our work at the Future Skills Center, as well as the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, in advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion, whether we're talking about organizations and employers or small businesses. So let's look first at what the net zero economy means. Essentially means that Canada is striving for an economy that either emits no greenhouse gas or offsets its emissions. For example, through actions such as tree planting or employing technologies that can capture carbon before it is released into the air. And as part of the 2022 federal budget, Canada announced a number of different initiatives to try to incentivize private capital investments into technology aimed at the net zero economy. Some of these are focused on emission reduction, and some are focused on emissions offsetting. We also in Canada have, by law, the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which legally binds Canadian governments to setting emissions reduction targets every 5 years and developing plans based on science to reach these goals. Each 5-year plan must also explain the strategies that will be implemented in order to reach our target by 2050. And this is unusual. Very often governments set policies, but Canada is one of the countries to actually embed this in legislation. What I would say is that to date, a lot of the focus on Canada's net zero strategy has tended to emphasize the role of large businesses in specific sectors. However, our view is that small, medium enterprises and entrepreneurs need more attention because they play such a large role in the Canadian economy, accounting for more than 90% of private sector employment. And in Canada, and it depends on who you listen to, for example, some reports say that SMEs are responsible for producing 30 to 40% of greenhouse gases. Others suggest it's even more than that. And yet when we talk to SMEs, while they may be concerned about sustainability and about global warming, 15% say they don't know where to begin, and almost a third say cost is a problem. Many say they lack the skills and knowledge to develop transition plans. They lack the funding, they lack the time. And even though climate is a concern, they don't know where to start. It's also clear that while the majority of SMEs want funding, they haven't found sources of financing to help them move forward with their net zero aspirations. And in fact, we did a review of federal policies and programs and found that just over 5% are specifically directed at small, medium enterprises. We believe that sustainability is fundamental to our success as a nation, and government has made commitments, for example, to the Sustainable Development Goals, which include not just environmental commitments, but also commitments to, for instance, alleviate poverty, provide quality education, promote gender equality, human rights, and so on. And our view is the Sustainable Development Goals are very interconnected. If you don't address, for example, gender equality, you can't address poverty alleviation. And we would argue if you don't address gender equality, you will not achieve your net zero emissions targets, given the important role that women play in entrepreneurship and small business. So when we look at sustainability, whether we're talking specifically about the move to net zero or whether we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, our view is it's directly connected with business goals and objectives. Of course, it's rooted in social justice and commitment to environmental goals, but it's also good for business. Increasingly, job seekers are looking for companies that align with their personal values. And we know, especially younger people, are very focused on environmental issues. We know that doing it well can help reduce costs and waste and improve efficiency. It can also reduce risks of various environmental impacts. It can improve brand image, reputation, and so on. And there's growing evidence that over the long term, businesses with sustainability initiatives will outperform others. We also know, as I mentioned at the outset, that not only are small, medium enterprises often underrepresented in considerations around sustainability, but women are often overlooked, partly because so much of the focus to date has been on green technology. And green technology, almost by definition, is very grounded in science, technology, engineering, math disciplines, where women tend not to be. We also know that we recently saw a global conference on environmental issues where only 15% of the speakers were women. And we know that there are linkages between sustainability and representation of women on boards. For example, studies in the United States have shown that organizations with a higher percentage of women on their boards tend to have more commitments to environmental, sustainable, and governance goals and objectives. When we look specifically at entrepreneurs, we also see that women entrepreneurs are more likely to develop businesses that combine economic sustainability with social and environmental goals and set targets. And when we take an intersectional perspective, we know Indigenous women entrepreneurs are more likely to prioritize sustainability and long-term perspectives than others. We've looked in some detail at the sorts of practices that women entrepreneurs embed in order to drive sustainability. And we know from the research that women are more likely to be social entrepreneurs. We also know that they're more likely, as I mentioned, to embed sustainable development goals as part of their own business, overall business objectives. And while men are more focused on economic outcomes, women tend to take a more holistic view. Studies have shown around the world that this is the case. And in some cases, it also is correlated with environmental violations. For example, in China, one study showed that having women CEOs tended to be associated with significant reductions in environmental violations. We did a study with the Bank of Montreal 2021, looking at over 1,000 women who had applied for their Celebrating Women grant program. And we found that most of the applicants had at least one sustainability initiative. Many of them focused on social sustainability, for example, poverty alleviation, inclusion in the community. 2/3 of them had a focus on economic sustainability and 50% on environmental sustainability. And almost half of them contributed to all three pillars. So when we look at environmental sustainability, we found examples of organizations that were trying to maintain a balance in their businesses to ensure that they were using renewable resources, that they were using practices to reduce consumption, recycle, reuse materials, and almost all of them had waste management and responsible consumption processes. One example was a farm owner who talked about how they had used processes to conserve water and waste. We have many, many examples of these. Organizations which, for example, have reduced packaging to divert waste from landfills, packaging-free grocery stores, for instance. Examples of ways in which women-led businesses have created opportunities locally for their communities in terms of job creation, but also commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's also evidence in the organizations that we looked at with commitments to, for instance, formalize their social enterprises, or to establish B Corp certification, or other initiatives that align them with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we saw evidence that women are more likely to put a focus on inclusive workplace practices, healthy workplaces, and so on. We also noted that there were women-led businesses that were focused on enhancing the accessibility and quality of education, which of course is foundational to many of the other sustainable development goals, and focusing particularly on equity deserving groups and those with special needs. It's not surprising because we know that women dominate the health sector, but we saw many women-led businesses in the health sector, but we also saw many applicants placed a high priority on health and well-being in their communities as well as in their organizations. We saw a number of businesses that were specifically focused on food security, vertical market, vertical gardens, and specialized forms of produce to meet particular needs, as well as using their corporate social responsibility programs to donate to food banks and shelters. And when asked what their future plans were, many applicants indicated that they expected to continue advancing their sustainable development agenda, promoting gender equality and human rights, expanding on education and training in order to build their communities, promoting health and well-being, improving their marketing and communication strategies to be more sustainable, to reduce packaging and so on, as well as committing to combating poverty in their communities and around the world. So what does this mean for the inclusive innovation agenda, and specifically for Canada's commitments around net zero? In our view, it means that we need to think about sustainability as being core across all sectors, across all programs. We have to recognize that the issues are not just affecting specific sectors. There's a lot of attention focused on oil and gas, for instance, but rather we need to understand that as with digital technologies, green processes are going to be core across all sectors. So think about it. It used to be that when we talked about digital skills, we talked about the information communications technology sector. We talked about programmers and engineers who were going to work in companies that made computers, develop software or services. Now we know there are more jobs in information communications technology roles outside of the ICT sector because all businesses use technology. All businesses need workers with digital skills. We anticipate we will see the same thing occur with what we refer to as greenification, meaning that right now there's a lot of focus on particular sectors. There's a lot of focus on green technology. But in fact, in order to achieve our net zero goals, we have to embrace a sustainability lens in every single sector of the economy, in organizations that are large and small. And for reasons I explained at the beginning, we need particular focus on small, medium enterprises and entrepreneurs, which are the backbone of Canada's economy, but often have less resources and fewer skills to actually pursue a triple bottom line. It's also important to ensure that we retain an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens because we know that certain segments of the population are more affected by global warming, and yet others are at the forefront of driving change. So one of the important things I really want to underscore is very often in Canada, when we think about innovation, we default to thinking about technology. But innovation is not just about technology. It's about doing things differently. A couple of examples. When we think about a vaccination, for instance, in my view, a vaccination is an invention. Inoculation, when the vaccination is actually applied to change people's health outcomes, is when we have an innovation. Similarly, artificial intelligence is an invention. When it is being used to do things differently, it's an innovation. And Canada historically has tended to have an implementation gap, whether we're looking at healthcare technologies, whether we're looking at green technologies, whether we're looking at technologies for water. It's always been ironic to me that the province of Ontario, for example, has hundreds of companies focused on clean water, but we still have boil water advisories in Indigenous communities. It's an implementation gap that we face across many of our sustainable development goals. And so we have to think about innovation, not just about creating new technologies, but also about, we have to think about innovation around the adoption of these technologies to do things differently. We have to think about innovation as the creation of new products and services, many of which I mentioned in the examples of women-led businesses coming up with new solutions. We have to think about creating new initiatives or even completely new organizations to drive change. And of course, changes to processes within organizations are critically important to consider. So this is something that is very, very important from a strategic perspective, and also for small businesses to think about whether or not they're in the green technology sector, whether or not they're in oil and gas, whether or not agriculture, and some of the sectors that we hear a lot about with respect to the shift to net zero. Every single business in every single sector has an opportunity to use new technologies, new processes, to develop new products and services to help advance our goals around the net zero economy. And so we need to be thinking creatively about skills. The skills are not just science, technology, engineering, and math skills, which are associated with developing new technologies, but the skills that are absolutely fundamental to driving innovation include the skills associated with organizational transformation, changing consumer behavior, policies and regulations, new ways of marketing and communication. And we know increasingly new jobs we haven't even thought about will be emerging. So to advance inclusion in the net zero economy, we have to be looking at who's included and who's excluded. And right now, we know that there is a gender imbalance in the sectors that are often the focus of strategies around net zero transition. We also know that even where women do work in clean technology, clean energy, waste management, and so on, they tend to earn 82 cents on the dollar compared to what men earn. We know that this requires attention because in order to achieve our net zero greenhouse gas targets by 2050, we need to be thinking about jobs and skills that will get us there. And one of the studies that we did looked at different scenarios. We know that the transition path that we take will be affected, for example, by government policy. Does government policy set a rapid pace of change as part of its goals, or is it more concerned about maintaining the status quo and a slower transition? What was interesting was, despite the different potential pathways governments may decide to take, the net result was more jobs across each of the three scenarios. We know, as I said, that the idea of green jobs is something that has tended to be fairly narrowly defined, and yet more and more the evidence is that we need a much wider variety of non-technology jobs, and we need to recognize the role that women, Indigenous peoples, and diverse entrepreneurs will play in getting us there. We recognize that some jobs may be eliminated in traditional industries, but we also see that overall the transition to net zero will create new jobs and transform jobs. We need to continually challenge the notion that the only skills that are required are related to science, technology, engineering, and math. And we need to recognize the importance of what we would call transferable skills, critical thinking, complex problem solving, innovation, and creativity. So when it comes to the jobs and skills economy, economic impact of transition to net zero, we have to think about where the jobs will be, and we have to think about training programs to get us there. We've developed a number of recommendations that complement the strategy the federal government has developed, with a particular focus and a particular emphasis on targeting small, medium enterprises and entrepreneurs to ensure that they have the skills that are required, to ensure that investors are considering sustainable development goals, and particularly our net zero commitments, when they're thinking about making investments in startups and small, medium businesses, and to better develop accountability frameworks. And so one of the things that we're really focused on is developing tools that will help get us there, helping organizations think through each step in their value chain and where they can innovate. And we looked at hundreds of companies to identify where the opportunities are, and to showcase companies that are making a difference. So, for example, when we think about inbound logistics and procurement, some companies focus on changing their suppliers to focus more on sustainable raw materials, to avoid, for example, contributing to the carbon footprint. When we look at operations and manufacturing processes, we're seeing companies emerge that are using recycling and reused materials to contribute to sustainable and circular economy. And there are examples across the fashion industry of companies doing this. We see examples of companies that are focusing on minimizing packaging, companies that are focusing on biodegradable packaging, companies that are focused on using virtual outreach and marketing and customer support to reduce their footprint, companies that are building environmental values into every aspect of their organization, companies that look at values in and knowledge around sustainability in hiring and retention, and also companies that are leading in technology development and new approaches. It's important to think about how sustainability can actually help build markets, as more and more customers are valuing commitments to net zero, and there are lots of ways to do that. There are increasing sources of funding to promote sustainability-related initiatives, and there's more information that we can provide on that. And I think overall what we see going forward is the importance of increased emphasis on empowering entrepreneurs, and particularly women entrepreneurs, to build resilient businesses, to think about circular economy and how green growth is critical for our economic and environmental futures, to think about ways we can reduce barriers and expand opportunities for greenpreneurs, as we like to refer to them, to focus on setting targets and measuring progress. This is one of the things the Diversity Institute is particularly preoccupied with. How can we equip small, medium enterprises with tools that will help them develop their strategies and track their progress? And we know that many SMEs are struggling to keep the lights on, and we have to give them tools that will help them pursue a triple bottom line easily, because many of them are committed to moving forward with sustainability, but unfortunately lack the tools to do so. And of course, we want to ensure that there are more resources available to support sustainability. So at this point, I would like to thank you for your attention and your interest in the conference. And of course, to thank the hosts and Strike Up for including me and the Diversity Institute.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for outlining how women entrepreneurs can lead the way in fostering sustainability. I encourage all of you to take a moment and reflect on what you learned in the chat today and on socials using the hashtag StrikeUp. Now it's time for our second networking break at Strike Up 2024. We encourage you to spend some time video chatting other women attending our conference right now live, or visit our partners in their booths and in their virtual networking rooms. As a reminder, our networking rooms will be moderated by topic, so find a room to jump into and join some engaging conversation. We will then break out into our last group of workshops for the day at 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, happy networking.